Hi, I'm Joel Baker, Director of the University of Washington Puget Sound Institute. As our region considers how best to manage nutrients to protect marine life, it's important to understand what we currently know about dissolved oxygen levels in Puget Sound, as well as how scientists explore when, where, and why the dissolved oxygen levels are changing. We're focused on dissolved oxygen here because a lot of our marine life depends on ample quantities of dissolved oxygen to breathe, just as we depend on the oxygen in the air that we breathe.
So let's start with a simple question. How do we know what levels of dissolved oxygen are currently in Puget Sound? We have a range of tools we can draw on to understand what drives the water quality in Puget Sound. And these tools include both monitoring and modeling. Monitoring, that is, putting people in boats and maybe having some automatic sensors out in the field, allows us to measure the water quality directly and precisely at given locations and at specific times. If you want to know the dissolved oxygen level in your favorite part of Puget Sound, there's absolutely no substitute for a direct measurement. However, measuring water quality can be challenging and requires trained people, expensive equipment, and continued funding to support sustained monitoring networks. We've become used to having access to real-time information about our lives and our health, and you may think that we also have real-time information about the Puget Sound. We live in the era of big data. How often do you think we measure dissolved oxygen and other water quality parameters in the Puget Sound? To give you a sense of the frequency and geographic resolution of water quality monitoring in Puget Sound, here are some examples. One way scientists monitor water quality in the Puget Sound is to deploy buoys that are equipped with sensors. There are currently 6 orca buoys located in Puget Sound, and they measure water quality 1 to maybe 4 times per day throughout the year. To complement those measurements from the buoys, the State Department of Ecology and others go out monthly to collect samples manually, where you're literally filling a bottle from a boat and taking it back to the laboratory for analysis. The State Department of Ecology collects samples at a routine monitoring network across 27 locations to inform long-term trends in water quality.
However, we can't be everywhere all the time. In our region, we're fortunate to have a portfolio of environmental models that model the watershed, Puget Sound, and the food web. These models build on the monitoring programs to fill in the gaps between the monitoring stations. Modeling also helps to interpret monitoring data to understand what is happening, to understand how the system is changing, and to predict how contemplated actions may potentially impact water quality.
So I hope I've given you a brief introduction in how people measure water quality, including dissolved oxygen in Puget Sound. Let's take a look at what those monitoring programs are telling us about the current conditions in the Puget Sound system. The first thing to understand about Puget Sound is that many parts are naturally low in dissolved oxygen. Most famously, the Hood Canal has experienced low dissolved oxygen concentrations for centuries. And there are 2 important reasons why parts of Puget Sound have naturally low concentrations of dissolved oxygen. The first has to do with the shape of the basins. Hood Canal and other terminal inlets that are poorly flushed are more likely to experience low dissolved oxygen concentrations because the nutrients stay in place longer and new oxygen is not mixed in as effectively. The other very important reason is that the ocean water that comes in with the tides through the Straits of Juan de Fuca into Puget Sound is enriched in nutrients and depleted in dissolved oxygen. This is a big flow of material carried by the tides. So large, in fact, we estimate that 88% of the nutrients entering Puget Sound come from this tidal exchange with the ocean. The Puget Sound monitoring programs show that the dissolved oxygen concentrations in the water are highly variable throughout the day and between seasons. Much of this variation is due to the process of photosynthesis. Much like the plants in your garden, when the sun shines on Puget Sound, algae release dissolved oxygen, resulting in higher concentrations during the day. For example, from the monitoring data you can see in this graph, the dissolved oxygen concentrations in Quartermaster Harbor change significantly throughout the day. Over about a week, they range from around 15 milligrams per liter to near zero. So depending on when you collect a water sample, you can get almost any answer you want for Quartermaster Harbor, depending on the time of day you collect the sample. While the short-term daily variation in dissolved oxygen is well documented and well understood, a separate important question is whether the dissolved oxygen concentrations at any location in Puget Sound are changing over the timescales of years to decades. Whether or not the conditions are getting better or worse is critical to management decisions. Looking at monitoring data from Port Jefferson as an example, the minimum dissolved oxygen concentration varies significantly over more than 2 decades. This variability makes it really difficult to tease out whether the concentrations are systematically changing over time. That's why consistent long-term monitoring is so important. Using a simulation produced by the SAILC model to fill in the gaps between the monitoring stations, let's explore the estimated minimum dissolved oxygen levels daily throughout 2014. As you can see from the simulation, the water coming into the Puget Sound from the Straits of Juan de Fuca is naturally depleted in dissolved oxygen. As the seasons progress, begin to see pockets of lower dissolved oxygen being created in some of the terminal inlets, including around the Whidbey Basin and in the Hood Canal. It is these pockets of low dissolved oxygen that are of concern. Hopefully this gives you a sense of how dynamic the system is. So when we ask how is dissolved oxygen changing in Puget Sound, the answer is not only it depends on what day, but also where. There are places where we see both low dissolved oxygen changes over time, but much of Puget Sound doesn't see depressed oxygen at all. So what do we know about what's causing low dissolved oxygen in these parts of Puget Sound during certain times of the year? Nutrients in Puget Sound are natural and necessary. They support the base of the food web. However, excess nitrogen from human activities can lead to low dissolved oxygen. By analyzing the sources of nitrogen that lead to dissolved oxygen depression, scientists have shown that about 88% of the nitrogen in Puget Sound comes from the ocean. We think about 3% naturally comes from the Puget Sound watersheds and rivers, and about 9% of the nitrogen in Washington State entering Puget Sound is attributed to human activity. This includes nutrients from wastewater treatment plants, septic fields, agriculture, and urban runoff. Modeling suggests that these nutrients from human sources may further decrease already low dissolved oxygen levels in shallow embayments and parts of Hood Canal. The map shows the greatest difference in modeled daily dissolved oxygen levels between 2014 conditions and a reference condition, which reflects our best estimate of what things looked like prior to European colonization. So we know from both monitoring and modeling work that the dissolved oxygen concentrations in Puget Sound are highly variable in space and time, but there are certainly pockets of Puget Sound that experience low dissolved oxygen levels. Whether that change will harm marine life depends upon when and where different species who inhabit Puget Sound are exposed, how sensitive those species are, and how they can potentially respond. In areas that have ample dissolved oxygen, a small change in DO levels would likely have little impact, particularly on species like salmon that can move away. However, in contrast, an area that already has low dissolved oxygen, an additional reduction caused by human activities could potentially move a species past its lethal threshold, especially if the species is immobile, like something like a mussel.
So to wrap this up, we know a lot about dissolved oxygen in Puget Sound and how the natural processes and human activities influence these levels. However, we know far less about how marine life is affected. Scientists are working together to understand the water quality requirements of critical Puget Sound species. As we better understand what marine life is telling us about water quality they need, we will be able to better design and implement programs to protect Puget Sound.